Marc Chagall, Part 1. The Boy Who Painted Dreams in the Sky. They say that Marc Chagall could paint dreams before he could even write his own name. But what if I told you that the man who gave the world floating lovers, flying cows, and cities suspended in midnight blue, was born into a world where dreams weren't meant to survive? It was the summer of 1887 in the small, windswept town of Vitebsk, a place where the winters felt eternal, where cobblestone streets curled like old spines, and where the scent of fresh bread mixed with the iron tang of the nearby river. The world into which Chagall was born was painted in shades of gray and brown, the muted palette of poverty, tradition, and quiet resignation. And yet, inside that young boy's mind, the colors sang. Childhood and the first brush of magic. Marc was the eldest of 9 children in a modest Jewish family. His father hauled heavy barrels of herring before dawn. His mother sold pickled fish in a small wooden shop. The family's life was humble, bound tightly by the rituals of the Sabbath, the old songs, and the whispered prayers at night. But Marc's eyes saw something beyond the cracked walls of their home. He saw blue goats grazing on the roofs of houses. He saw fiddlers dancing on moonbeams. He saw himself flying, arms outstretched, over the market square while the townsfolk below went about their daily business, completely unaware of the boy soaring above them. There was no art school in Vitebsk then. No museums. No galleries. The closest thing to a masterpiece was the ornate Torah scroll at the synagogue. But one day young Marc stumbled upon a schoolboy in the street, drawing. It was nothing special, a crude sketch of a horse. But to Marc, it was as if the gates of heaven had cracked open. He watched, entranced, as the boy's pencil brought something alive on the paper. That night, Chagall stole a piece of cardboard from his mother's shop, dipped a chicken feather into ink and began to draw. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment his life turned. First obstacles, tradition versus vision. His family didn't understand. Art is for the Gentiles, his uncle spat one evening. For rich people, not for us. You'll starve. But Marc couldn't stop. It wasn't just drawing, it was breathing. The local art teacher in Vitebsk, a stern, skeptical man, at first refused to take him in. But after seeing the strange, dreamlike quality of the boy's work, he agreed, muttering, "You draw like someone who's been here before. Like you're remembering something." The fire inside. Chagall began to fill every scrap of paper he could find, the margins of newspapers, the backs of shop receipts, with visions. His neighbors thought he was odd, the boy who draws flying horses, but the more they whispered, the more determined he became. When he was 19, against his family's wishes, he left Vitebsk for St. Petersburg, the great imperial city, a place of grandeur and cold indifference. He arrived with nothing but a small suitcase, a few rubles, and a hunger so fierce it could swallow the winter itself. But St. Petersburg would test him. It would teach him that the path to the skies often begins in the shadows. Part 2. Hunger, Shadows, and the City of Light. The Winter of the City. When Marc Chagall stepped off the train in St. Petersburg, the city was like an endless cathedral of stone and ice. Grand facades towered over the streets, their windows glowing faintly in the early dusk. But for a poor provincial boy, the beauty was almost cruel. Here, the rich moved like ghosts in furs and silks, while the poor trudged through slush with hollow eyes. The capital was intoxicating, but dangerous. It demanded money for everything. A room, a meal, even the right to breathe. Chagall had almost none of it. Worse, because he was Jewish, he needed a special permit to live in the city, a pale of settlement law that treated people like they were shadows that could be erased. Without it, the police could throw him out at any time. He lived in a small, freezing attic room with no proper bed. Sometimes the frost formed on the inside of the glass, turning the window into a pale, ghostly painting of winter. His meals were often just black bread and tea. But in the evenings, he painted. The first glimpse of the surreal. Chagall had managed to enroll in a small art school under the painter Nikolai Rurik, whose mystical landscapes seemed to hum with secrets. Rurik saw something strange and untamed in the young man's work, shapes that didn't obey perspective, colors that felt like they were pulled from dreams instead of nature. "Don't lose this," Rurik told him. "Your sky will never be the same as anyone else's." Those words became a kind of mantra for Chagall. While other students sketched proper portraits, he painted men carrying houses on their backs, brides floating in the arms of invisible lovers, and green-faced fiddlers playing violins under moons that looked like molten gold. His classmates mocked him. Critics would have laughed. But Marc was beginning to understand something dangerous, that his paintings were not meant to imitate reality. They were meant to free it. Love in a time of hunger. It was during this time that he met Bella Rosenfeld, a young woman from a well-off family in Vitebsk, visiting relatives in St. Petersburg. Her eyes were like dark constellations, and when she laughed, it felt like spring arriving in the middle of winter. In Bella, Chagall found both a muse and a mirror. She believed in his vision even when the rest of the world seemed blind to it. Their conversations were full of poetry, secrets, and dreams of escape. But love could not feed him. Hunger gnawed at his days. And so, when an opportunity came to study in Paris, the very beating heart of modern art, Chagall didn't hesitate. He packed his brushes, kissed Bella goodbye, and promised to return. The leap to Paris. In 1910, Marc boarded a train bound for the West. The journey itself felt like a painting. Landscapes melting from snow to green fields to the golden haze of France. When he stepped into Paris, it was as if he had walked into color itself. Montparnasse was alive with painters, poets, and madmen. Cafés smelled of coffee and turpentine. The studios of the École de Paris buzzed with arguments about cubism, fauvism, and the future of art. Here no one told him to stop. No one laughed when his cows floated or his brides danced in the sky. In fact, they told him to go further. Part 3, Paris in Flames of Color. The city that painted itself through him. Paris was not simply a place, it was a fever. By day, Marc walked along the Seine, sketching bridges and street vendors. By night, he sat in smoky cafés with poets and anarchists, listening to them argue about the future of art as if it were the future of the world itself. Picasso ruled the scene like a dark prince, his cubist armies dismantling reality into shards. Modigliani wandered the streets like a saint of beauty and ruin. Chagall was the outsider among them, the dreamer from the Russian provinces whose canvases ignored logic entirely. And yet, the critics began to whisper. His work, hung in the Salon de Independence, stunned the Parisian public. They called it poetry in paint, and a hallucination you want to live in. Colors as weapons. Chagall's palette was an act of rebellion. While others argued over form, he attacked the senses with colors that felt alive. A cow was not brown, it was crimson with a sky-blue face. A bride's veil was not white, it was the yellow of a sunflower lit by the last light before a storm. To him, colors were not just shades. They were emotions, memories, even prayers. When a friend once asked why his paintings ignored the rules of gravity, Chagall smiled. In dreams, no one falls. Love across a continent. Bella's letters reached him every month. They smelled faintly of violets, and her handwriting seemed like part of a secret painting only he could see. He painted her again and again, floating through blue skies, embracing him above rooftops, her face luminous against a night full of stars. In Paris he had models and admirers, but none of them could eclipse the quiet, unshakable pull of Bella. She was his anchor and his flight at once. The shadow of war. 1914 came like a slow-burning fuse. The cafés still hummed with talk of art, but in the newspapers the headlines thickened with rumors of conflict. Marc told himself it would not touch him. War was the business of generals, not painters. Then that summer he returned to Vitebsk for what he thought would be a short visit, and the world closed its borders. The First World War tore Europe apart. Marc was trapped in Russia, cut off from Paris, from his friends, from the city that had given him wings. Yet, in that isolation, another chapter began, one that would test his love, his art, and his very survival. Final chapter, the last flight. A world on fire. War followed him like a shadow that refused to let go. He escaped the Russian Revolution with Bella at his side, clutching little more than a few paintings rolled under his arm. Paris welcomed him back, but the Paris he returned to was not the same one he had left. The cafés were quieter. Many friends were gone. And somewhere deep inside, Marc knew, there were wars you could never truly come back from. The Paris years again. He worked obsessively as if painting could heal the fractures in his soul. His canvases now carried both joy and mourning. Lovers still floated above rooftops, but sometimes a darkness bled into the edges of the frame. His village of Vitebsk would reappear, bathed not in sunlight, but in the cold, unreal glow of memory. Bella was his eternal muse. Every time he painted her, it was as if he was trying to stop time, to keep her forever young, forever looking at him with that gaze that said, "Marc, the world is still beautiful." Exile once more. The Second World War forced him to flee yet again. Paris fell under the Nazi shadow, and for Chagall, a Jewish artist whose work was labeled degenerate, there was no safety. In 1941, with the help of friends, he escaped to America. In New York he was celebrated, but he never stopped missing Europe, its churches, its markets, the crooked streets of Vitebsk. He painted the city of his childhood as if it still existed, as if each brushstroke could resurrect it from the ashes. The final light. Bella's sudden death in 1944 shattered him. For weeks he could not lift a brush. But grief for Chagall was not just an absence, it was a color. And slowly, painfully, he returned to the canvas, now painting Bella as an angel, a bride in the sky, always just beyond his reach. The years passed. He remarried, traveled, designed stained glass windows that caught sunlight like fragments of eternity. His colors grew lighter, softer, but they never lost their dreamlike glow. The last canvas. In his 90s, Chagall would sit in his studio in St. Paul de Vence, the Mediterranean light spilling over the walls. He painted as if he was already half in another world, figures floating higher, faces turning toward an unseen horizon. One morning in 1985, the brushes lay still. The man who had painted love in every shade of the spectrum was gone. Epilogue. Today, his works hang in the world's greatest museums. But Chagall's true legacy is not in frames or on walls. It's in the idea that reality is only half the story. The rest is the dream we dare to see. And somewhere, perhaps in some sky no one has yet painted, Marc Chagall is still holding Bella's hand, drifting over rooftops, the world below shimmering in impossible colors. If you felt the pull of this story, remember, art is not just a thing to look at. It's the place you go when the world becomes too heavy to stand.